Welcome, everybody. This is the second in a series of talks that we're calling C4C talks, and they're on different issues. Center for Change has several different issue areas that we advocate for, one of them being water. And so tonight we are joined by Professor Renee Richer, and we're very excited to hear more about harmful algal blooms in the Great Lakes. This is something you may have heard about in the context of Lake Erie, but what she has to say tonight was definitely very new to us and our leadership. And so we wanted to bring you this information and also to talk about how we can take action to prevent this from becoming more of a problem in our Great Lakes. My name is Owen Goslin. I'm the communications director here at Center for Change. And so I'll just be facilitating tonight. Renee, Dr. Richer is going to be speaking for about 25 minutes or so, sharing some slides and information about her research. And then we'll have time for a question and answer period. So we have guests on Zoom who will be able to ask some questions. But if you're following along on Facebook and the Facebook Live, you can type your comments there in the comment box, and we'll relay your questions to Dr. Richer. So I'm going to go ahead and just introduce to you a little bit more about who Dr. Renee Richer is. She comes from the UP, and might have her talk a little bit more about herself. But just to give you her professional biography, Dr. Richer received her BA in biology from the University of Chicago and her PhD in biology from Harvard University in 2004. She then worked for a while Cornell Medicine in Qatar, that is the Gulf state country of Qatar, from 2007 to 2014, and then joined the University of Wisconsin Green Bay at Marinette Campus in August of 2014. So she's had quite an interesting breadth of experience, but has come back to the UP. Dr. Richer's conservation work at the American University of Armenia was recognized by the Whitley Award, which is the UK's, the United Kingdom's largest conservation award. Her current work focuses on the intersection of biological processes, sustainable development, and human health. For the last decade, she has been working to understand routes of human exposure to cyanobacterial neurotoxins, such as harmful algal blooms, and their driving role in ALS, otherwise known as Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson disease. So we're going to hear a little bit more about something that you, if you're like me, may have heard a little bit about, these algal blooms that have been occurring on the Great Lakes, but they're much more of a serious threat than I had realized. And so we'll allow Dr. Richer to talk more about her research. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I'm very, very pleased to be here. I was excited to be in contact with Owen and bring up the idea of actually having this presentation on harmful algal blooms, because it's now becoming so dominant in the press. We're starting to see more and more stories about water temperatures increasing and about attempts to regulate the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, particularly phosphorus, entering the waterways. So it's a very timely topic right now. And so I just wanted to give you a brief introduction into what are some of the key drivers behind harmful algal blooms, and also what are the health consequences. So harmful algal blooms are comprised largely of cyanobacteria. It's a photosynthetic bacteria, but they produce a number of very, very potent toxins. And so I'll give you just an introduction to that tonight. As Owen said, I am from the Upper Peninsula. I'm from Gladstone, and I graduated from Gladstone High School. And I have to give a little shout out to my biology teacher, Mr. El Salmi. So without his encouragement, I would have never pursued the field of biology. So you never know how important teachers are at critical times in our lives. So I always want to thank him for the influence he had on me. So I have a few slides which I think will help facilitate and help us to visualize harmful algal blooms and then the impacts. So the first thing I want to do is illustrate what the water looks like in a harmful algal bloom. So let me see here. I'm putting this. Can everyone see it on screen share? Owen, can you see or no?
I don't see the screen share showing up.
Okay. All right, so let me go. I have to go to screen share here. And then if I do this, it will come up. How's that?
Yes, we got it.
So when you have an algal bloom, the water will appear to very much like a pea soup. And as you can see in this image here. And so I want you to be aware that there can be other green things growing in the water. There can be small plants. There can be other types of algae that are not particularly harmful. But when you see this type of pea soup appearance of the water, this can potentially be what we call a harmful algal bloom. And here again are just some images to show. Here you can see a boat going through Lake Erie. And again, you see that appearance of this green pea soup in the water. Saginaw Bay typically has algal blooms, which you can see in the image. The western part of Lake Erie regularly has harmful algal blooms, as well as the Green Bay. And so this is one reason I want to draw our attention to harmful algal blooms, is that we are starting to see them occur further and further north. Okay. All right, so what are some of the key issues regarding harmful algal blooms? The first is increasing temperature. And so as the temperature of the water increases, the bacteria, they're also known as blue-green algae, okay? The photosynthetic bacteria really respond and they grow much quicker. So we see a lot of growth and reproduction with rising temperatures. Now that's related to climate change. And as we know right now, the Great Lakes are on average between 6 and 11 degrees warmer than normal. So we're starting to see this great temperature rise. And the second very, very important point is that we're seeing more nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. And part of that has to do with increasing rainfall. But we're also seeing more nitrogen and phosphorus, which is being released from a variety of sources. So that could be when we add fertilizer to our lawns. It could also be due to some specific soil conditions. So in the Upper Peninsula, the soil is very different than what we see in the Lower Peninsula. And in the Lower Peninsula, there are some areas that naturally have more phosphorus. So you can get phosphorus coming from a variety of sources. Industrial agriculture is also a source, right? The waste that the animals produce, that's a source of nitrogen and phosphorus as well. So those are some of the key issues that we're going to be talking about, is temperature and nitrogen and phosphorus. So one thing that has also been out in the news in the last week has been this great increase in temperature in the Great Lakes. So right now, Lake Michigan is about 11 degrees warmer than normal. We're seeing parts of Lake Superior 6 degrees warmer than normal. And in Lake Superior, we're now starting to see algal blooms in areas where we haven't previously seen algal blooms. So the rise in temperature is helping to fuel the growth of these bacteria. All right, let's I want to answer the question then, why is it that rainfall is related to nitrogen and phosphorus? And this isn't necessarily very intuitive. So I made a little slide here that I hope would help clarify that. So I'll share my screen here, and let me just put this little slide up for you. Okay. All right. So as we have more rainfall, and again, increasing rainfall, we're seeing in the area surrounding the Great Lakes. This is because of rising temperatures, climate change. So for every degree increase in temperature, we're seeing around 7% increase in precipitation, either as rain or snow. So that has been modeled in our climate change models, and it's exactly what we're seeing in the area. So as we see that increase in precipitation, we're getting more runoff, right? So nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, from the land into our waterways. That can be from animal waste. It can be from us fertilizing our lawns, or golf courses fertilizing their lawns, or it can be from soils which naturally have a lot of phosphorus. But one thing that we're facing, which is also really important, is our own waste. So as we see more precipitation, many of our wastewater treatment plants are having to release untreated sewage into the lake. We've been seeing that in Escanaba and Gladstone. We've had a number of releases of untreated sewage because of the high water levels in the lake, but also because of that increased rainfall. And the wastewater treatment plants then aren't able to process the water coming in fast enough, and they have to release it. So whenever we see more rainfall, we get more nitrogen and phosphorus released into our waterways. And in fact, Lake Erie this summer is predicted to have only a moderate bloom because of low rainfall this spring. So there's less nitrogen and phosphorus as a result of that lower rainfall. All right. So let me just pause here a minute. And so the blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria, cyan means blue or green in color. These are photosynthetic bacteria. So they photosynthesize just like plants do, and that's why they're fertilized by nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, what's interesting is that they produce very, very potent toxins. Probably the best known toxin is going to be microcystine, which is a liver toxin. It's a tumor promoter. It's responsible for multiple human deaths, many animal deaths as well. So we have a long history, a long record, scientific record of microcystines being very dangerous for human and animal health. If you remember, a few years ago, Toledo had to shut down their water supply because they had a harmful algal bloom in Lake Erie, and that was producing a lot of microcystine. And that's why we saw Toledo shut off that water supply from Lake Erie because of the microcystine. But our blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria, the main component of harmful algal blooms, also produce neurotoxins. And one of these is a very fast-acting neurotoxin, which is similar to our chemical weapon, sarin gas, and has caused a number of animal deaths, very fast animal deaths. In fact, it's known as very fast death factor. And so there's a potential for exposure to that, although that is a little bit less common than exposure to some other neurotoxins, which are slower acting. They accumulate in our bodies and are directly linked to ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. So let me just put up a slide and remind you what those neurotoxins are. Okay. All right, so the most common toxin, or the one that we have the most amount of scientific information on, is microcystin LR. This is our liver toxin tumor promoter. The neurotoxin, which causes very quickly death, colloquially known as very fast death factor, is anatoxin AS. That's also produced by harmful algal blooms. And then the three next toxins you see here. The name is not that important, but BMAA, this is beta methyl aminoalanine. DAB is diaminobutyric acid, and AEG is amino ethyl glycine. And these are all isomers of one another. So meaning that they're similar in terms of their structure chemically. And these we can be exposed to in the water. If we have aquatic organisms like fish, mussels, any filter feeders, they can accumulate those in their tissues. So when we eat aquatic organisms, we can also be exposed to these neurotoxins. And one other thing that we are starting to learn more and more about is that as the wind flows over lakes or water bodies that have cyanobacterial blooms, harmful algal blooms, those toxins and our algal cells can be aerosolized. In other words, they can be forced into the air. And so we can also be exposed to those toxins through the air. And what we see is that there are hot spots, in other words, high rates of neurodegeneration associated with consuming organisms from lakes with algal blooms, living on the downwind side of a lake with algal blooms. Okay. So our potential exposure can be in the water. So water skiing, swimming, other types of recreational activities. Last summer, there were a number of dog deaths that were associated with harmful algal blooms. That's because the dogs will go into the water, they swim around, they come out, and then they try to clean their coat, and they'll lick their fur, and they get exposed to the toxins then. So we can be exposed via water. We can also be exposed in the food that we eat. So again, we're seeing higher rates of ALS specifically associated with consuming food that comes from water bodies with harmful algal blooms, and also in the air. So again, we're seeing high rates of ALS in particular associated with living on the downwind side of lakes or water bodies that regularly have harmful algal blooms. So the evidence is coming out really in the last 20 years. We're seeing a lot of evidence from the United States, from the East Coast of the United States, from Florida, from the areas surrounding the Great Lakes. We have a colleague working at Cleveland Clinic, one of the head neurologists there who has a study going on. We have a lot of evidence coming out of Europe, harmful algal blooms in the marine environment as well. Again, lots of evidence coming out of China. So this is something which we've only seen a lot of research in the last 20 years, which is probably why you aren't as familiar with it as you might expect to be, right? So the science is fairly fresh, but it's quite strong. So we see that exposure to BMAA, one of our slow-acting neurotoxins, causes the key neurological damage, which we know is causing, for example, Parkinson and Alzheimer's disease. So we see neurofibrillary tangles, and we see plaques directly associated with exposure to that neurotoxin. So the evidence is becoming more and more predominant, which is probably why we're starting to see more in the press about harmful algal blooms and preventing harmful algal blooms. So are there any questions so far? I see a few questions in the chat box. Owen, do you want to jump in? Should we start question and answer now, or would you like me to clarify any points that I've made?
No, I think we can, I think we can move on to questions and answers, and probably a lot more information is going to come out as we go through some of the questions that people have. So yes, one of the questions we have is from Dixon, and he asks, how much testing is being done for these toxins?
Right. So the best known toxin produced by harmful algal blooms is microcystine. And so most of our water treatment plants will be testing for that. They'll be looking for the presence of the cells, the cyanobacterial cells, and they will be testing for microcystine. And again, that's why we saw Toledo have that problem with water quality because of the harmful algal blooms. But in regards to the neurotoxins, those are not being tested for yet. Okay, and that is something that my colleagues and I are trying to promote, to bring this type of awareness in regards to policy, that these are things that we need to be aware of and that we need to test for. So again, the science is really building behind this, and we hope that in the near future, we'll have more testing. You can send water samples off to a variety of different labs, and I can make that available to Owen, or we can put it in the Facebook comments that will test if you want to get your water tested, but this isn't something that's done on a municipal level yet.
Thanks. I have one question of my own to follow up on. With the danger to water quality, is this just for communities that are getting their water from, let's say, Lake Michigan, from Green Bay, Saginaw Bay, or should we be concerned about our water even where we don't see algal blooms? Or should we be concerned about groundwater contamination?
Yeah, so one of the areas of study that I have been looking at is looking at how these toxins may move through sediment, right? So how they might migrate through sediment from surface water sources to contaminate groundwater sources. And so that's an area that I am actively involved in, and there are some other researchers as well trying to address those questions. And some of the toxins we see do move much more readily, and we're starting to see some evidence that we could have groundwater contamination. So in certain situations where you have let's say a lake, and you have a well which is near that lake, and you have an algal bloom, you might see some migration into groundwater sources. So again, the data there is very, very new, and that hasn't been explored fully yet. But it looks like certainly that's a possibility. And we're also, again, seeing that the toxins can migrate at different rates. I saw there was a question from Joanne about, have we talked about aerosolization of the algal blooms? And so that was something that I just had mentioned briefly, that if you have an algal bloom, let's say on a lake, and you have wind, those cells and the toxins can be aerosolized. So again, we are seeing hot spots, in other words, higher rates of neurodegenerative disease associated with the downwind side, right, of a lake. So if you're living on that downwind side of a water body that regularly has harmful algal blooms, you may have a greater rate of exposure through the air. So again, that's some nice data that's coming out of the eastern United States.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I think that is an issue about algal blooms that I had no idea existed, and is really worrisome. The fact that it could be picked up even if you are not drinking that water, it can be aerosolized.
Yeah.
We have another question in the chat. What about water used for irrigation of leafy crops from water with algal blooms? Is that something that's a problem, or does that occur?
It is. This is really interesting from a scientific point of view, but concerning from a public health point of view. And what we're starting to see now, and again, there is data coming out for lettuce and for wheat and other crops as well, that if they're irrigated with water, which has an algae bloom or has a lot of cyanobacteria in it, something like a stagnant reservoir, where you might see more of that. that the neurotoxins can be incorporated, and also the liver toxin microcystine can be incorporated into the body of the plant. So this is not that you get the water on the surface of the plant and you can wash off those toxins. No, the plant is actually taking up the toxins through the roots, and it's being incorporated into the body of the plant. So there's another potential mechanism or route of exposure. So not only through fish and mussels, but also through leafy crops, plant products that have been irrigated with that water.
Yeah, that again, that's unbelievable and something that was entirely new to me. Marlene asked a question. Marlene, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
I think it probably just follows that it makes fish from these areas dangerous to eat.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yes, and again, if you are consuming fish from a lake which regularly has algal blooms, that would be an area of concern. So some of the first hotspots of neurodegenerative disease, particularly ALS, was these were identified in northeastern Wisconsin, so just in the Green Bay area, and that is associated with consumption of fish. And so we think that may actually be related to mercury. So mercury is a neurotoxin, which means that if we have algal blooms and mercury, you can get two neurological hits, right? Consuming fish that have both mercury and algal neurotoxins. So that's a particular concern. And this is something that we're seeing in the area. We are seeing these hotspots of neurodegenerative diseases associated with consumption of fish.
Thank you. And Dixon, you have a question about septic tanks and whether there might be a relationship there. Dixon, do you want to ask your question?
I'm pretty sure I'd read about this over the past couple of years when Joanne was running. It was an issue, I think, in Lansing that we don't have apparently, Michigan does not have a statewide septic tank regulation. As far as leaking tanks, which we all know are related to eutrophication and this whole problem with algal blooms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dixon, you're exactly right. So Michigan is the one state that does not have a statewide standard or regulations for septic tanks. So that responsibility goes to the township and to the county. So it's managed at that level, not at the statewide level. So anytime you have the release of animal waste, right, and that can be human waste as well, that's always a risk of nitrogen and phosphorus getting into our waterways. I see that there was a question essentially related to that, saying, I thought our water drainage from streets was separate from our wastewater treatment. And then, why does heavy rain increase the amount of untreated wastewater released into our water bodies? So for many areas, particularly in the Escanaba-Gladstone area, we have illegal sump pumps, which are putting a lot of water into that wastewater treatment system. And again, if you have the open tanks where the water is being treated, all of that increases the amount of water that's coming into the wastewater treatment plant. So anytime you get that excess, you have a heavy rain, you're going to get a lot more water coming into the water treatment plant. That could also be from leaks as well, right? So many of the pipes have leaks in them that allow more water to come into the plant.
Thank you.
And if anybody on Zoom has a question, you're welcome to put your question in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask directly. Jenny asked a question. Can you explain more about illegal sump pumps?
Okay. So again, this is a problem in our own Escanaba area, is that homeowners, right, will have sump pumps in the basement to pump out any excess water that is coming in. But what they're doing is they're putting that into the wastewater system. And so when you have a heavy rain and you have a lot of water come into the basement, they're sending that into the wastewater treatment stream. And so that is a problem that we have in the Escanaba area, is that we have a lot of excess water coming in then from those types of sump pumps. So they shouldn't be sending the water into that wastewater treatment stream, and many homeowners are. Oh, and then Jenny says, well, so where is that excess water supposed to go? I don't know. I think maybe they're supposed to be releasing it out on the lawns or on the land. I really don't know. That's a question I'm not able to answer. So I'm sorry, Jenny, I'm not sure about that.
So you mentioned the connection with the contained animal, or was it concentrated animal feeding operations?
Yeah. Yep.
The so-called CAFO, CAFO. So in your view, is that the primary culprit here with the source of the nitrogen and phosphate that is making its way into our water, and then in turn the harmful algal blooms? If we were to focus on that, would that be enough? Is that the primary drug behind these really large blooms that we've been seeing recently?
Well, you know, it is difficult to manage nitrogen and phosphorus release if you have what we call a non-point source. So let's say everyone who's living along the lake is putting some fertilizer on nitrogen and phosphorus on their lawn. That's much more difficult to regulate and to manage. So the CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, these are very large scale organizations or operations that then produce a tremendous amount of animal waste. And the question is, well, how do we manage that waste? And so this has come up recently because Eagle has recently modified their nitrogen and phosphorus regulations, right? So they're trying to limit even more nitrogen and phosphorus, which is entering our waterways. And that has received some pushback from these large organizations. And one of the issues has been, when can we spread manure on the fields? When can we spread it on the land? And the hope was that it wouldn't be spread in the winter when it is less able to actually infiltrate and percolate down, and it's more likely that you would see runoff from that. So that's been one issue. There's also been a desire by Eagle to do phosphate testing of certain areas, and that is also an issue which is under contention. And we're seeing sort of large large animal organization operations contest those type of regulations. But we don't see that same scale of nitrogen and phosphorus, production or release in our much smaller farms. And I can show you here. And Joanne, if you want to comment on that as well, if you want to comment, I think you would be a very good person to comment, given your own farming background. Okay, so let me show you here. I'll pull this up. And Right, so this is a map which comes from the Sierra Club, and you can see these concentrated animal feeding operations, largely based in the
Thank
lower.
you, Renee. Hopefully you can hear me okay using my
Okay,
computer mic.
yep, go ahead now.
Yes, I had the opportunity to testify last winter when Eagle had hearings surrounding the new regulations about not allowing the CAFOs to apply manure on frozen or snow-covered ground. I think it's a really interesting subject. One of the questions I asked at the time is we really need to clearly define what is frozen ground. Because I know as a former farmer in northern Michigan that there was times in the spring when the yards were becoming, very deep with thawing manure. But yet the fields by afternoon in the sun could be too soft to haul on. And so you were kind of in a catch-22. So you might haul real early in the morning while the ground was still frozen, but by noon it wouldn't be frozen anymore. So I think maybe since then they've defined that a little closer, but I think it's important to point out that we have the Sierra Club has done a lot of work around supporting, making sure that we are doing what we can to prevent runoff from the large farm operations. And then we have Farm Bureau really advocating on the other side and has had a lot to do with the pushback and the continued to water down those policies. So I think it's important to name those organizations and the work that they're doing, and so we can reach out and support the Sierra Club.
Yeah. And that's really why I'm here tonight, was just I want to make us all aware that there are health implications, very clear health implications to managing nitrogen and phosphorus in our waterways. And when we talk about harmful algal blooms, it's not just that they look bad and they're gross and they smell bad, but there are real health consequences to these algal blooms and exposure to them. We are seeing in the United States and other countries as well, we're seeing this great increase in rates of neurodegeneration. And it looks, right, there's nice evidence that exposure to these types of toxins are a contributing factor to that.
Thank you. I wanted to just clarify for everybody watching, when we mentioned Eagle, right, that's the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And so we'll provide a link to their nutrient framework on phosphorus and nitrogen in the comments tomorrow, unless Joanne, you're able to do that now. But yes, I think that your point that you're making, Renee, is really good. That I think we're used to seeing those pictures from Lake Erie and the green slime, and it looks unsightly. But it's really not the algae so much as the toxins that that come with the algae, which are really quite dangerous, go through the water, through our food sources, and even through the air we breathe if we happen to be downwind from one of those. So these are all really important points that you brought to our attention today. Just want to make sure if there are any other questions from our Zoom audience or Facebook.
Hi, this is Eileen. I have a question. I'm sorry, I entered late, so I don't know if you already addressed it, but how do we get into our communities to talk about these things? Because, all of our communities in northern Michigan along the water, there's all kinds of, they use pesticides continuously and weed killer just on the lawns alone. And how do we get that to, we need to find a way to let them know how toxic the algal blooms are and how we can, try to prevent that from continuing.
Yeah, well, that's part of what we're doing tonight, right? And so the more people are aware, the more we can get organizations like the Center for Change, which is hosting me tonight, to try and help people understand what are the implications of that. And, you know, why is it that Eagle or other organizations in surrounding states, why are they working so hard to limit that phosphorus? And I think once we understand, then we'll see, okay, this is the pathway we need to go forward on, and how do we best do that?
So are there communities that are already, you know, on board with doing this and regulating it so that?
Yeah, for example, in Ohio, if we talk about other states, they have put a tremendous amount of effort into reducing phosphorus because of Lake Erie. The western portion of Lake Erie is quite shallow, so the water temperatures are higher, and that regularly has algal blooms in it, you know, anywhere from moderate to severe. But they are trying, I think they need to reduce now still about 400,000 tons of phosphorus entering the waterway. So Ohio's working very hard. The Wisconsin DNR is putting a lot of effort into limiting phosphorus entering waterways. So we're starting to see that push. We're starting to see that statewide push for eliminating phosphorus or reducing phosphorus entering the waterways.
Oops, thank you.
And also Canada, of course, on the opposite side is also joining in. So just a reminder that the Great Lakes are 20% of the world's accessible fresh water, probably one of the greatest resources that anyone could imagine or have access to. And so it's really our responsibility to make sure that.
I just want to jump on and piggyback, and please let me know if you can't hear me well.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had two audios going. Do I have the floor?
You do. Go ahead, Joanne.
Do I look confused? I'm definitely confused listening to two things that are lagging differently from one another. But anyway, I just wanted to add that that's a great question, Eileen. One of the things that the Center for Change is really all about is helping people advocate for change that they want to see in their communities. And okay. Oh, goodness. So we have had the opportunity to be granted some funding this year that we will be able to utilize to bring on some different tools that we can use to communicate with people in our communities, such as like texting tools where we could be texting out information to people, phone banking where we could be phone banking around some of these types of issues, and also producing literature and other things that we could supply. So I also just want to add that Clean Water Action is one of our working partners. And I just spoke with Mary, their director, last night on some of these very same issues, and they're working on these as well. So we'll continue to collaborate with them. So I encourage anybody that's interested in working with us on these to email Northern Michigan Advocacy or go to our website, Center for Change, and click on the volunteer button and let us know that you're interested in helping. And we'll put those links in the chat and in the message center too.
Thank you, Joanne. Any further questions?
I see a comment from Dixon in the chat here about Lake Erie and the EPA. And I think it's important to note that we see some fantastic work come out of the EPA, but also at times we see the EPA is not always the fastest in responding to the science, right? So there's always a lag, and sometimes there is pushback from industry or other organizations. And so hopefully we will see action on these types of water issues.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the, again, one of the good points that's coming out of this conversation is that we really need a coordinated response from all the people who live in the Great Lakes on either side of the border to tackle this. And so although we may feel like we have been remote from this issue for a while, as you point out, these are going to become much more prevalent up our way if with global warming and with the possibility of large CAFOs in the northern part of our state. So it's important for us to be aware of this and to advocate so that we don't have this become more of a problem up our way.
Yeah.
Jenny has a question. Jenny, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering about the state of Michigan. Aren't the rules and regulations from Lansing, aren't they constantly getting pressure from corporate interests so that there's an attempt, I knew there was a couple years ago, to make it so the Great Lakes does not have the extra strong protections that they historically have had, and that's federal law now supersedes state law. Is that true? You think with the Great Lakes? Do you know about that, Dr. Richer?
Yeah, that's not something that I could comment on directly. I know obviously there's always pressure, right, to eliminate regulations, and particularly now pressure to eliminate environmental regulations. So I don't think that goes away, but I can't comment directly on the federal versus the state. I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, thank you.
But I see Dixon is in here. Maybe he could comment on it.
Oh, I'm not a lawyer. What? Yeah, there were attempts in Lansing to not allow the state to have environmental laws that would be stronger than the federal laws. And then we all know that Mr. Trump, I mean, just look in the past 48 hours, his assault on the federal laws. However, when we got into our problem with the drinking water and lead standards, all of a sudden Republicans under Rick Snyder became progressive and wanted to have stronger laws for lead in the drinking water after they dropped the ball on their own feet with Flint. But this all gets back to the Republicans control the state legislature. That's why we need to send Dr. Richer to Lansing. And we need to, more than anything, I think we need to find out who is sponsoring bills that would, just as an example, would put stronger regulations on these factory farms, and then find out what committee those bills are sitting in, gathering moss, and demand that the hearings be held. So in a perfect world, we'd be doing this meeting tonight when we'd have all the Sierra Club people and the Clean Water Action people here. And then within 48 hours, we'd be making phones ring off the hook. I'll let the floor go back.
Well, so let me follow up on that. Is one thing that we do in the environmental sciences is we're always doing cost benefit analysis. And I think if you look at what is the cost to the population, and I'm talking real financial costs of Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's, there is a tremendous cost to people and to society personally, but also financially. And, you know, if you compare that to what is potentially the cost of regulating nitrogen and phosphorus, I think we'll see that ultimately it is worthwhile. So You know, I always go back to my grandmother who says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we see that as well, that we save money when we do protections from the beginning.
Yes, it really makes sense for Northern Michigan, where we have a fishing economy. We have, of course, tourism is so important. People move here for the fresh water. Of course, people everywhere want fresh water and safe drinking water. So this is right, something that's both in our economic interests, our health interests, and our human interests. As people who have a special responsibility towards our Great Lakes. So I just want to make sure we have just a couple of minutes left. Are there any final questions for Dr. Richer?
Where do they have you in the polls? How are we doing on your campaign?
Well, tonight I'm speaking as Dr. Renee Richer, Assistant Professor in Natural and Applied Sciences, so I won't
You want
comment.
to throw the switch. You're the candidate now, and we're all for you.
I think the Center for Change is a nonprofit organization, and I don't think that we can discuss that.
No, we're here to gather information, and it's up to us to find pathways to advocate and to find ways to move our politicians and representatives to take action on this issue, which we've all been informed about. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Richer, for coming tonight and sharing your expertise. This has been is very illuminating to me, and I think a lot of people who have joined. It's not something I was tracking. It was something I saw out of the corner of my eye when I read newspaper clips on Lake Erie. But I think your broader points connect to a lot of our larger concerns about climate change, about the health of our water, our responsibility to future generations. And so I appreciate you taking the time to engage with the public. Not all academics do that. So I very much appreciate your generosity for being with us tonight.
And thank you for inviting me to share my beloved field of research with you.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining. This video will be available on Facebook afterwards, so please share it with your friends. And we will be following up on our own Facebook page with specific actions that we can take if you are concerned about this. The first, of course, would be just sharing this information more widely, but we'll also provide avenues for writing our representatives about this. So look for us, follow us on our Facebook page, and we'll have more about that tomorrow and in the days to come. Thank you all for joining.
All right, thank you, see you.
Thank you.